Hello everyone, welcome to this course on Indian writing in English translation. Uh, Today I will introduce you to a very important theme, one of the most pertinent and most important theme of Indian writing, not only in English but also in translation. And it is important to remember that Indian writing in English and translation are closely related. India being a land of various languages and cultures, and English being one of the latest languages which added to its civilization through the impact of colonization. Uh, the title of this today's talk is Gender, Ink and Resistance, Writing Against Patriarchy. Gender, ink and resistance. What kind of collaborative relationship these three objects can have with each other? I will start with that. Ink refers to writing, but writing, the meaning of the word writing has a larger impact, influence, and structure of meaning, uh, in the sense that writing not only refers to the physical act of writing, but also refers to the various forms of oral literature, the various forms of experiential narratives, which goes beyond the scope of literature, but at the same time, it is closely connected with literature. Because any form of writing, any kind of writing which comes from the emotive and experiential apparatus has a certain degree of literary value. Because literature works through language, and language is a formation which produces meaning both directly and indirectly, through speech and through silence. So, today's talk will talk about the interplay of meaning, language, and silence, representation, and aphasia. These are the key terms with which I will craft this lecture, because these are the key terms which constitutes the meaning of women writing in India. So this is basically a lecture on women writing in India, in modern India. But in order to understand how and what women are writing in modern India, we need to go back to its past as well. Because women writing consciously or unconsciously against their patriarchal oppression, subjugation, is connected across generations. Sometimes women have consciously revolted against the apparatus of patriarchy. They have knowingly developed a feminist theory, a feminist discourse. Sometimes they have just talked about their experience, about what they think and feel. So this entire structure of feeling has a connectedness and a continuity. But we also need to understand women's resistance and women's writing in terms of frequent, successive breaks across generation, across time, but also across space. Because we know that though India is a nation state, India is national unity, it is also a collection and conglomeration of various cultures. And not only it is a collection of various cultures and cultural divide, but there are also other kinds of divide operating in Indian society. The division of class, the division of caste, the division of region, the division of language, the division of religion. All this and the voices of women from all these areas, that their differences, their diversities, is what constitutes women's writing in India. Because when we talk about women's writing, we should not confine ourselves to a particular monolith. Because women's writing actually reacts against any monolithic formation. This is something which you all need to remember, we all need to remember. Because the women's voices actually emerge from the margins of the society, from a position where they are not allowed to speak. We know the famous essay by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak? And there Spivak comes up with the example of an upper caste woman who cannot speak who is in a position where her speech is not allowed to be listened to other people. Can the subaltern speak? Doesn't give the opinion that the subalterns cannot speak, but it talks about a certain structure of speech act where certain voices are not allowed to reach to the mainstream. So women are essentially the subalterns, what Gayatri Spivak could call positions without identities. They occupy certain positions, but their identities are erased, negated. So what are the strategies invented by women in order to counter this silence, in order to counter this marginality, in order to counter and interrupt this lack of representation, is the objective of today's lecture. So, when someone is speaking, not only it is not about the act of speaking, but when one is bearing out oneself, one is speaking about one's experiences, which are different from other people, and more particularly which is different from the way the mainstream represents those entities. It definitely constitutes a form of resistance. So writing is resistance. So when we talk about gender, ink and resistance, we need to understand that the process of inking, the process of writing, it itself a kind of resistance. And when we talk about patriarchy, again, we need to remember that patriarchy is also not something which is unilateral. But because patriarchy is closely related to culture and society from which it emerges, the different forms of marginality. And patriarchy not only dominates women, but it also dominates the men. Patriarchy is the dominant power structure which privileges certain individuals as the guardians of the society. Because the meaning of the word patriarchy is the rule of the fathers. Sometimes mistakenly we say that patriarchy is rule of men, but it is not to be translated as rule of men, but rule of father figures. The father figures are mainly men because the society is structured that way. And the principles, the moral, ethical, intellectual principles, which is imbibed by us from our childhood, which is imbibed from the culture where we belong, it is basically dominated by the male ideas, by the privileges, by the unconscious, taken for granted privileges of men over women. So this kind of cultural formation can be counteracted by the marginalized, subjugated subjects like the women. It can also be counteracted by other entities, but gender can be focused as a form of resistance against the patriarchal formation, where sometimes the nation state, sometimes the guardian in the family, sometimes the harbingers of society and culture, the harbingers, the protectors of language, and the political figures, they control what will happen to others. So, by understanding patriarchy in this way, we can look into the gamut of women's writing in India and how across time and space they have reacted against patriarchy. So initially we need to contextualize Indian women's writing in the global scenario, in the context of the women's writing in the world, across the globe, not only in the Western societies, not only in the Western culture, but also in different cultures, marginalized, colonized, dominated, subjugated by the West. Within the West, but also outside the West. We need to talk about the other women who exist in the peripheries of the mainstream society and culture. We need to talk about the women who lives in African nations, who lives in Latin American nations, who lives in the Canadian and Australian Aboriginal cultures, along with the Indian women who speak from the peripheries of the colonies, of being colonized once upon a time, but who are also colonized by the men of their own family, by the men of their own culture. We need to understand that women's marginality is double-faced. They are marginalized by the outsiders, but also the men who are intimate to them, the men who are closely connected to them in terms of family, culture, nation, and society. So this double revolt against one's own culture and also against the other cultures, which often identifies women's bodies as site of violence, is the crux of women writing in India. And we need to understand that, and by saying so, we need to resist the idea of a singular woman's writing. Women's writing is not singular. It is not monolithic. It is multiple, and it is contextual. And we should also understand that women's writing also doesn't mean a group of women writing with a particular agenda. When we talk about women's writing, we bring the question of feminism. But what kind of feminism we are talking about? We need to understand that the third world feminism is very different from the first world wild Anglo-centric feminism. So when we talk about women's writing, we also need to invent feminism as feminisms. Feminism in terms of plurality. Because the feminist discourse which percolates and is received by us is dominated by a kind of Western cultural imperialism. It travels from the West to the East. I'm not saying it is always negative. Such travel is not always detrimental. Sometimes it is productive. Just like the traveling of the ideas of women's emancipation in the 19th century from Britain to India, to parts of Gujarat, Maharashtra, or Bengal. So there is a kind of productive engagement, but there is also the tendency to be appropriated by the Western feminism. Like Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, when she is writing this book and publishing it in 1792, towards the end of 18th century, which becomes the key text of Western feminism. She relates the idea of feminism and gender activism and resistance with the idea of a general human rights. But can we have a general human rights in a world so divided by race, culture, caste, class, ethnicity? That is a question we need to bring in again and again. So if we think of women's rights as gaining certain rights which men in the Western society enjoys, and to become like men, that has a detrimental effect on our understanding of feminism. Particularly when we read women's writing from India, we will see that the Indian women are sometimes situated in a way that they can't even think of such a quote-unquote equality. If we don't have the circumstances of equality, how can we claim equality? Or can we think of equality only to become like men? Or we can think of women's body, women's subjectivity, women's emotional self, which is often considered as negative. Because there is this binary of the intellectual self and the emotional self. The intellectualism is associated with men. I'm not saying that men can only be intellectuals. Definitely, it is untrue. But the intellectual self is privileged because it is often associated with male identity. And the emotional self is often considered as negative, even in case of men. If men becomes emotional, it is considered as a negative thing. So all these ideas are challenged in the Indian women's writing, who write from their locatedness, their situatedness, and who subvert the androcentric, the male-centric assumptions of value, of ethics, of morality. Women's writing in India, it focuses on women's bodily subjectivity, their sexual self, and doesn't claim to be neutral. The idea of the neutral human always privileges the male principle of goodness, of being ethical, of being intellectual and perfect. So Indian feminism would try to challenge that. And there is a long period of time where by feminism we understood the idea of feminism which comes from the white Anglo-American world, which has been reacted against by people like Chandra Talpade Mohanty, as you can see from this quotation, that she talks about the feminist writings kind of from the West hegemonizing the third world women and essentializing them as victims But the third world women are not only victims, because all women in the society, in certain sense, are victims. But when they are asserting themselves, when they are talking about their pain, their suffering, and then when they are writing about those pain and suffering, they are definitely reacting to the Western idea of feminism, of gender activism, and they are reacting against the male domination. They are writing against patriarchy. So, exposing one nowadays, vulnerability has become a very major tool of feminist research. People like Judith Butler have written books on vulnerability as a tool of research. When you expose your vulnerability, exposing the vulnerability is also a form of resistance. That we can see the texts which come from the partition memoirs of women, the partition novels by women, or the exposition of the political violence, sexual violence on women, which is described in during the time of political struggle, like Mahashweta Devi's Draupadi, to which we will come very soon. And we have to understand that the Indian women's writing and the understanding of Indian women's writing is mired in the general understanding of third world feminism, and the African women's movement and the African women or the other marginalized women are also writing against the imperialism of white feminism on the other women, the quote-unquote other women. We will come to the question of other women in a different way very soon, when we will talk about the indigenous women in India, the Dalit women in India, who thinks differently, who talks differently. Then I focus on the major central concerns of women's writing, and I have talked about certain aspects of the central aspects of the women's writing in India. One is the struggle against aphasia and invisibility. So when in the early phase, when women are writing, they are writing in order to portray themselves, just portraying their causes, their trauma, their pain, their way of life itself constitutes a form of resistance, because nobody knew what happens to women, how women feel and think in a patriarchal society where they're subjugated, where their rights are restricted, they're not allowed to do many things. Then comes the question of representation. I will come very soon to the question of representation and how it has been discussed by Gayatri Spivak. And then there is this writing of the everyday experience, because when we talk about literature, there is this idea of objectivity in literature. Literature talks about all human beings. Literature is something which is larger than life. Literature is something which is not concerned about the immediate, but the greater good of larger number of men and women. We talk about world literature. We talk about the ethical principle of literature. We talk about literary artists as the unacknowledged legislators of the world, if we follow the romantic thinkers like Wordsworth. Here, in case of women's writing, they talk about the quotidian, the everyday, the family, the household in a major way, and the description of the household. As we know the famous Western feminist slogan, again now we are resorting to Western feminism to some degree, the personal is political. So they talk about the quotidian, the everyday, and sometimes, unlike the Western feminists, the Indian women writers, they talk about the quotidian and the everyday without any agenda. But how we will see how that lack of agenda, the kind of insignificant self, the bearing out of the insignificant self, becomes a political move towards asserting oneself and writing against patriarchy. So writing itself becomes a subversive act. So ink itself becomes a form of resistance. So very importantly, women's writing forms what we call the emotional history. The historian Rajat Kanta Rai and the descriptions of the man-woman relationship in Bengali literature, which he portrays as a kind of alternative historical archive. He talks about the emotional aspect of the man-woman relationship as a kind of sign of understanding the society and culture and how patriarchy works, how the everyday of men and women operates. So he's trying to talk about the bearing of women's self in literature as a representation of society and culture in the larger way, not looking at society and culture from a larger historical standpoint, a universalist standpoint, because the universal idea of history talks about the rise and fall of empires, the change of the governments, the politics. But the family and the quotidian spaces are considered as inferior concern, as insignificant concerns. So when women are writing about themselves, they are actually framing a kind of emotional history of not only themselves but also their culture and society. Going back to the question of representation, women's writing, if we theoretically approach women's writing in India, we will see that women's writing in India is twofold. It talks about the two essences of the word representation. Word representation in literature, in language, in linguistics, in language studies, talks about presenting something in a new way, which definitely women's writing does. Women's writing talks about the everyday affairs, even the political, social events in a new way. When they talk about the partition, when they talk about the political violence, political struggle, when they talk about the riots, so when they talk about the communal violence, they talk about experiences which are unscripted. So they represent, but they also represent. Representation in politics means representing a community. So when certain communities are not represented, underrepresented, we know that a political leader represents a group, a community. Similarly, women's writing, it represents women in a larger way. So women's writing is not only about a particular woman or about her experience, but it is about a kind of collection of experiences. We talk about the literariness, the literary aspects of women's writing. First thing I need to say, and I must say, is that women's writing, not only singular women's writing, but the project of collecting women's writing, of studying, understanding women's writing itself is a literary act. How it is a literary act? What does literature do? Literature brings different experiences into an ensemble, into a narrative structure. So when there is a serious absence and aphasia of women's experiences, you can know the experience of a particular woman, but you cannot claim that that particular experience is universal and true to all women, women of all class, all religion, all caste, etc. In order to understand what constitutes womanhood in India, as I already said, that womanhood is not singular, it is plural. But there are also certain common standpoints, commonness of experience, which cuts across the difference. So, using that phrase from the book by Deluge, we can talk about the women's experiences as a series of repetitions and differences. There are certain repetitions, certain similarities of experiences also across women of different classes and caste, culture, etc. So, when we talk about that, so women's writing is a collaborative project of restoring women's voices from different corners of the society, from different times and climes, from different temporalities and specialities, and collect them and form a kind of historical narrative. So women's writing is not only important for the literary studies, but it is also important for the historical studies. It creates an alternative archive of history and politics. It represents the lost and invisibilized voices of women, and it becomes an object of history. So we see historians like Tonika Sarkar or Uma Chakraborty taking active interest in women's writing, in women's literature, and collect them as historical material, but also transforms the idea of history. The idea of history as something objective, as something out there, something impartial, but infuses it with the emotive experiences of women, which deconstructs, interrupts the myth of objectivity. History is not objectivity. Objective standpoint is always the standpoint of the majority, of the powerful. So women's writing is also about continuously reframing the idea of history from within. And this reframing is constituted, again, as I already said, by the emotive selves of the women, about their vulnerabilities, about their victimhood, but also by their sexual desire. Sexual desire of women is something which is unscripted, unreferable, unutterable. So there is another form of aphasia. It is very easy to talk about women's emancipation if we put emancipation uh, within the kind of gamut of the middle class, married, family oriented women. But when we talk about women's desire, which goes beyond the normative desire, like in a text Lihaf by Ishmat Chugdai, we will come to that text which talks about the women's desire, women's bodily desire. Their desire to be something else. So, something else than their situated role in patriarchal society. We come to this collection. This collection is a very important collection, one of the pioneering collection of women writing in India by Susi Tharu and K. Lalita, edited by Susi Tharu and K. Lalita. And I would say women's writing is not a singular woman writing about something, but it is a collective of women who are writing, but also who are editing, interpreting the text, writing introductions to the volumes. They all constitute women writing. The act of editing, collecting and editing women's texts from 600 BC to the 20th century is also an active act, and then also maybe beyond. There can be other volumes continuing in the 21st century. And also there can be also different volumes where sometimes we talk about women's experience of displacement, sometimes we talk about women's experience of partition, when we talk about the women's writing on political violence. So there can be different manifold forms of women's writing, which is very important. So this is a very important anthology, and that anthology talked about the project of women's writing in India. Women's writing is an active act of weaving. The idea of weaving is very important, because when we talk about text, the word text is etymologically connected with the word textile, which means weaving. The act of the textualizing is also textiling, like weaving a cloth from the scattered threads. So we get the scattered threads of women's writing and we actively weave it into a tale, into a narrative. And this project is always incomplete. It is always processual. It is always in process, because the experiences of new women in new context will always come up, which is unknown to us. New forms of patriarchy will emerge from that experience. In this particular quote, you can see that Supriya Chaudhary talks about how insignificant lives of women become significant by this active act of weaving, of bringing together, in the form of text, but sometimes also in the form of videos, cinema, documentary, discussions, women writing about other women, women constructing the biographies of other women. There is this famous reconstruction of a woman's biography by Maithili Shivaraman. She constructs her grandmother's biography from the scattered materials in a blue trunk. That shows how women's writing come into being. This is a very important text. I will refer to this text because this is the pioneering text of women writing in India. This is the first women's autobiography in India and in Bengal. And this is perhaps the first autobiography by anyone, be it men and women in Bengal. It's a very important text, Amar Jibon, where Rashundari, who is an ordinary middle class or upper middle class woman, a married woman who had 12 children, who got married at the age of 12, she just describes her life in detail with candid realism. Realism that is at times very shocking to us. He doesn't complain. He doesn't subvert the power structure directly. But he talks about the experiences of her marginality, of her pain and suffering in vivid details. She always takes recourse to a kind Almighty, a divine spirit. Again, we can think of the impact of the Bhakti movement on Bengal and how the rhetoric of Bhakti, which brings the human and the divine together, helps her to transcend her pain and suffering. So, and she claims in the autobiography that she has started reading and writing to read the Chaitanya Bhagavat. Chaitanya Bhagavat is one of the pioneering Bhakti text from Bengal. And she continuously surrenders herself to the God and puts herself to the protection of the Radha Madhav, the God she worships. So this is very important in the context of women's writing, particularly when we see that the secular understanding of feminism, of women's writing, is interrupted by the religiosity of Rashundari's writing. She uses a religious rhetoric, but not to surrender herself to patriarchy, but also to describe her pain and suffering. And she takes recourse to that invisible transcendental Godhead to be emancipated from this situation. But that is not the only form of feminism which we have in the subcontinent. In the introduction of that book, Women Writing in India, Sasi Tharu and K. Lalita refers to a text by the 18th century poet Muddu Palani and her text Radhika Shantanam. In Radhika Shantanam, we see the exposition of a woman's sexuality, where Radha is giving advice to her niece about how to please Krishna. And in the way of doing so, she talks about the female desire. We know that there has been several versions of the love story of Radha and Krishna, and the seduction of Radha by Krishna, but there is no alternative to that. It talks about the male, most of the narratives talks about the male desire. But this text by the courtesan poet Muddu Palani talks about the female desire. And this exposition of the female desire made the male-dominated society uncomfortable, particularly when in 1910 it was edited and published by another woman called Bangalore Nagaratnamma. And the colonial state issued a kind of summon against her. And it is ironic to know that Ishmat Chugdai, after writing Lihaf, which is translated as the quilt in English, also received a summon for the crime of obscenity. Because Lihaf is a story which talks about the existence of lesbian relationships, about queer desires within the family, within the household, which question the sacrosanctity of a quote-unquote Hindu culture, of a quote-unquote Indian culture, where women are supposed to be only householders. While Rashundari writes her protest in a particular way of religious language, these authors, we see, they express their protest in terms of exposing the female desire. That is also a form of protest. Now we will come to the last form of protest, which is the exposition of women of the political violence which is done on them. Women's writing in India is an active act of weaving together, bringing together narratives and experiences. And those experiences would also include the oral history. Because in the oral narratives of the partition victims, I have shown 2 volumes from 2 different editors, and one of the editors of both the books happens to be women. The Trauma and the Triumph, which collects the partition experience of the women from Bengal, and The Other Side of Silence, which has been edited and rewritten by Urvashi Botelia, which is a collection of the experiences of women from the Western Front. Both these stories, they weave together the experience of violence, the experience of homelessness of women after partition. So Indian partition could be seen in a new light by women's writing. That is the point which I am trying to make. So the impact of the women's writing is not only on patriarchy, quote-unquote patriarchy, that is the domination of the men, but also the domination of some men who decide the fate of the rest of the nation by engaging in an act of partition without thinking what will happen to the marginalized, vulnerable entities like women and children after the partition. So, and definitely the impact of the political violence is always on women. Whether it is partition or it is a political struggle, women's bodies, just like women's bodies in patriarchal society, becomes the site of protection. We all know that the Indian subcontinent has been protective about women. They have honored women. But the opposite side of the honor is to dishonor women in the time of a political violence, which we find in Draupadi, in the short story Draupadi by Mahashweta Devi. From this, we talk about the other women, the experiences of the other women. Women need not expose their lives only in terms of being household women, only in terms of their domestic struggle. but also in terms of different political struggle. And we can understand it when we refer to the Dalit women's lives. The Dalit women are marginalized by their own community, by the men within the society who have absorbed the upper caste ideas of patriarchy, of subjugating, protecting, in the name of protection, subjugating their women. They also talk about the violence done by the upper caste society on the bodies of women. So we need to understand women's resistance in terms of this multiplicity. Thank you.